So, welcome to the second episode of Do Not Flush. In today's episode, we are joined with Mark Lockhart. When it comes to fire and emergency management, Mark has seen it all. With over 42 years of experience, he served as a firefighter, as a paramedic, and chief in some of the most demanding environments. From leading emergency response teams in Maryland Heights in Missouri to serving as county fire chief in Stafford County, Virginia, along with serving as state EMS director in Wisconsin. Mark's career is a testament to dedication, resilience, and leadership in the face of crisis. Today, as the director of the Office of Emergency Services for Durham County, North Carolina, Mark oversees emergency preparedness and response for one of the state's most dynamic counties. His work spans coordinating resources, leading teams, and ensuring the safety of residents through both natural disasters and day-to-day emergencies. In this episode, we will ask a big question. What's really driving the increasing complexity of emergency management? Is it the unpredictable nature of disasters, misaligned priorities, or something else entirely? Mark helps us navigate the answers and shares stories from his decades of experience on the front lines. Mark, thank you again for joining today. Would you describe your career as something unique?
My career has been a blessing. From my time as a paramedic on an ambulance for a rural district in Missouri outside the St. Louis area to my position today here in Durham. It has been a blessing to have worked with some of the finest professionals in the industry.
What's a normal day look like?
In fire and EMS, I don't know that we say there's any such thing as a normal day. For me, though, in an administrative position, it's a little bit more well-defined, and it typically involves conference calls, Teams meetings, in-person meetings, and a lot of coordination. We have a lot of different resources that we try to coordinate. In some cases, that's just in trying to handle the day-to-day emergencies, but then also trying to plan for this week. It's going to be weather related.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a constant cycle of coordination and communication.
And I mean, after 42 years, would you say you're so passionate about your job, but you're still kind of
I love my job.
really?
I love the career. I love the people that I work with, and I think that's been the one thing that's been consistent throughout that time is it's the people.
Yeah.
Not just the people that I work with, people that I work for, but the people that we're here to serve.
So, what would you describe as your least favorite thing about your job?
My least favorite thing about my job, I think it's probably dealing with the glacial speed of bureaucracy.
Wow.
Government can be challenging in a number of ways, and I say having worked at both the county and the state level, and having interacted at the federal level, it can just sometimes be extremely slow and, my view, overly complicated. What seems to make common sense, it is not, and it's not as common as it used to be. But I think that's the frustrating part, is that there's a lot of things, a lot of opportunities that we have, but we have a lot of obstacles put in front of us that we have to overcome. And many of those, I think, are just unnecessary. I think we're trying to check a box, or we're not just trying to manage risk. We're trying to completely avoid it. And in fire and emergency services, that it's all about risk and trying to manage it, not avoid it. So I think that's the least favorite part, is just trying to deal with that sloth-like speed of bureaucracy.
You remind me of that movies, I think, was it called Zootopia or something? With it, one, I'm not going to mention the government department was, it wasn't a part of the emergency services, but they were depicted as having been staffed by.
Yes.
But that's interesting. And so you're saying that risk is inevitable. It's all about being able to manage it versus trying to avoid it because that's not realistic. Would
Correct. And I think it's reasonable to want to manage it, but there are some risks that we see in emergency services that even when you try to manage them, even when they're managed well, still present an overwhelming risk to that entity. And so you have to understand that no matter how many attorneys you have researching it, no matter how many contracts you have in place, no matter how many interlocal agreements there may be, there's still going to be a risk involved. And so we try to manage that but not avoid it. You can't avoid it. It just that doesn't translate into this field.
Interesting. And let me ask you this: do you think this is kind of has it worsened in the past few recent years with the COVID pandemic, where we kind of just got in the mindset of like, we can stop this, we can take control of this, we can prevent this. And I know we're talking about two different things, but it kind of talks to the mindset of like we can control the uncontrollable, well, but then realizing we can't. Do you think that has further exacerbated the situations where we're at today that has created some of the complexities you're seeing in your job, or would you say it's always been this way?
I I think it's I think it's been this way for some time. I think it probably has gotten worse in the last few years, just as society has become more litigation happy, and so that's created a whole other field of study for attorneys,
Hmm.
and in trying to avoid risk, um, and figure out how we eliminate it. Um, and my own personal feeling is a lot of times we waste time trying to figure that stuff out. It's just we got work to do. We need to move forward with it.
Would you say AI has done anything to help out with work, or has it been at all introduced in any facets of your job, or not yet?
I think it's interesting because AI is beginning to come into its own within the field. We've used AI a little bit in EMS as far as generating narratives and patient care reports. It's just based on data points that you check, and then it generates a narrative. I think what we're going to see is AI used perhaps more in predictive uh, data work and trying to do the data analysis, whether it is in fire behavior or it's in call volume for EMS or what have you.
That's beautiful. That's great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that case, from a government perspective, you're actually on top of things when it comes to AI. Because I know a lot of private sector companies, some of them haven't even touched it, even though it's been like with the recent buzz around AI for the last 2 years. Believe it or not, I've had conversations with some folks that they say we still haven't had AI being introduced to us, like things like ChatGPT or a version of it that's they don't have it yet. So
I think we're starting to see a realization that it's here, and so we need to figure out how to harness that technology and leverage it in the work that we're doing. I know in government, we've leveraged it now where we've used that for a chat bot for our website, and they'll be rolling that out shortly, which is designed to help folks navigate what is a massive uh, repository of information. So I think we're starting to see the beginning of that, and it will just continue to evolve over the next couple
well,
of
that's
years.
great to hear. I'm glad to hear that. So let's kind of shift a little bit here, some perspective on the recent wildfires in California. We've seen like some footage that basically looks like a scene from an Armageddon film. It's truly devastating, and our hearts go out to the folks that have been affected by it. Um, for my first question that, I mean, actually, I had several questions pop in my head when I saw this, but one of the questions that kind of came to mind is, you see this very often on the West Coast. Is it likely to ever for us to ever see something like it on the East Coast?
You have the opportunity for wildfires to happen anywhere, and we see them in all parts of the country. They're just more prevalent on the West Coast because of the setting, the weather, and you're there on the coast. Here we would typically more see a forest fire, But you also have the weather is a little bit different on this side of the country. So I think the potential is always there for something like that. I just don't think the potential is as great here as you see out in California.
So would you say it's because of the microclimate of California in general, versus kind of what you might see? I know this is not something you're top expert on, like, global climate. I don't think a lot of even that community, they keep arguing, debating with themselves. But to me, it seems like it's more of a microclimate, maybe, what's happening, because of the drier weather in California than it is here.
Yeah, I think it's California's weather obviously is drier. The Santa Ana winds play a huge role in what we've just seen recently, but actually in all of their fire behavior. And it's interesting as they debate whether climate change has had an impact or not. That is not an area I have any expertise in, but when you look at how you prevent a situation like that, you, you know what the winds are like, you know what the temperatures are like, you know that it's dry, you know that it's a fire prone area anyway, and yet we build structures out of highly combustible materials.
We still build our homes based on how the colonials built them. So
So when we stop building structures out of highly combustible materials in the most fire prone areas of the country, and we adequately staff and resource emergency services, you'll begin to see that risk reduced.
I couldn't agree more. I know also, a lot of times I see things that happen in Florida with hurricanes, and you see people, like, your whole community is devastated. Embassy would go back and build the homes the same way. One time I recently found out that if you were to, I think they put these kind of foundation kind of pillars, if I'm not mistaken, into the ground. If they dig it like 10 feet deeper, it would actually make a much bigger difference with fractional extra costs. Like, the additional cost is marginal. But we don't, which to me is like, isn't that the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and then having, the country face the like major catastrophes that affect so many people, and yet no change, which to me is baffling.
Well, and if you look at Florida, again, another area of the country that's had their fair share of disasters, when they're building new homes now, they're not building them out of wood. They're building them out of concrete and cinder block. When you go to visit a new home in Florida, the front door does not open inward. The front door opens outward,
Oh, okay.
so that the hurricane force winds, don't push that door open. So I think Florida is a prime example of an area where they've learned lessons
Oh, really?
from their
Okay.
experience and have moved to change their building codes, have moved to change their standards. And, even if you look in parts of New Mexico, which is the desert, those homes are built from concrete and adobe, not commonly seen as being combustible materials.
Yeah.
And so there's been lessons learned, and those lessons have been applied then going forward.
Interesting.
It will be interesting to see what Los Angeles does with rebuilding.
Is it true that in Europe, to prevent some of these kind of wildfires, they actually clean up some of the debris, or like when the tree falls, what have you, but we don't do that in California? It could be a cause. I don't know if.
No, LA Fire Department actually has a division, I believe, that is their role is fuel removal.
Okay.
So they will go out and try to remove those fuels from the area. Another part of living in that type of a setting is knowing how far back you need to clear fuel from your residence. The problem that they've had the last couple of weeks have been the embers from the fire being picked up by those hurricane force winds and then carried some distance. And so if you've got burning embers landing on your roof,
That's it.
it doesn't matter how far back you move the fuels from the house, you're still got potential then for that to catch the structure on fire.
Maybe you probably can't speak to it on a national level, maybe a local level, but do you feel like are our funding priorities in place, or is politics also, the kind of red tape bureaucracy is also kind of causing rifts there too, in terms of where to allocate the funds in order to be able to better respond to these emergency situations?
Funding is always an issue, and as money gets tighter, budgets get tighter. Localities have to look at where their priorities are. Part of the issue is that in many cases, law enforcement is seen absolutely as an essential service. Most folks would view fire service as an essential service. There are a number of states still in this country that do not consider EMS an essential service.
How is that possible?
That's a good question. I don't know how you can consider that to not be an essential service. And when I say that, I say that that's how their funding is reflected. Law enforcement has a lot of opportunities, drug seizure money, forfeitures, and that type of thing. The fire service doesn't have that same opportunity. Now, there is federal funding. There are a number of grant programs for staffing and equipment and that type of thing. And for EMS, though, you just really don't see that same level of support. And in many cases, especially when we look at the opioid crisis, there's a lot of funding going to law enforcement and not much funding going to EMS. And EMS are the ones really at the tip of that spear because we're treating the patients of opioid overdoses and we're treating those folks who have tried drugs for the first time and had an adverse reaction. But we've seen that shift a little bit now with the federal opioid settlement money. It's going to localities, and so now that responsibility has shifted to localities to try and determine where those dollars are best spent. And many of them are putting money into their EMS programs, their community paramedic programs, and issues like that.
So you would say things are slightly improving.
Yeah, so they may have.
That's good to hear. In the last 42 years or last 4 decades, would you say your job has gotten more difficult? Or for the folks that are on the front lines, would you say their jobs have gotten more difficult with time? Or have they gotten, or is it kind of the same level of challenges that have always been in place?
It's definitely gotten more complex. When I went through my initial fire academy training, we talked about hazardous materials, but really kind of in the scope of a fuel tanker on the highway.
Or household stuff?
Right. And so over time, then within the first 5 or 6 years of being in the fire service, suddenly the fire department now was handling hazardous materials response. And we weren't just dealing with fuel tankers, we were dealing with tankers that were hauling hazardous chemicals. We were dealing with rail cars that were carrying hazardous chemicals. We did some technical rescue, but again, it's evolved now to where we're doing structural collapse rescue, we're doing confined space rescue. That's on top of your vehicle rescues and the things that we had always been responding to. We've become involved in counterterrorism and anti-terrorism.
Really?
Primarily in the area of special operations, where many EMS systems now will have paramedics embedded with the local special operations team, with law enforcement. And so those are things that when I first started, we didn't really envision. We issue all of our EMS staff a ballistic vest now when they join our agency. If you had told me 42 years ago that we would be giving EMTs and paramedics a ballistic vest for work, I probably would have laughed. We just didn't anticipate that threat would be towards us.
That's insane to hear. And with that, you're saying that so it's difficulty level has increased and budget has decreased and there's more red tape than before. Am I accurate so far?
I think so.
And they don't even count this as given the vital role they play, they're still not considered an essential service.
In some areas of the country, yes, that's absolutely correct.
Can I ask a somewhat difficult question? You don't have to answer it, but I'm going to just be remiss if I don't ask it. Would you, first off, answer, is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Would you say this is aligned with one party or another politically, or is this kind of just depending on the region and has no affiliation?
I don't, you can't lay it at the feet of any one
Okay.
political party. I think a lot of times, and I use the fire service as an example. Everybody loves firefighters.
Yeah.
Um, you know, law enforcement, not everybody's crazy.
Yeah.
EMS, people love EMS. Um, and so I can't really say that one side of the aisle or the other is to blame for this. I think it really depends on the locality. And it's like Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. Well, that's absolutely true in this case, because you may have one area where the provision of fire and EMS services is a top priority and it's got bipartisan support. And you may have another area where, while the issue has bipartisan support, the funding simply isn't there. So then it becomes an issue of, well, how do we fund this? Some states tack on an additional amount of money to your vehicle registration to help with that. Others will tack it on to moving violations. And so there are some opportunities. There are some states that leverage that. But you do have some areas of the country where that just is not
So,
not the case.
and based on what you just said, first of all, thank you for answering that question because I know a lot of people are going to be probably wondering, and coming from somebody that has the level of expertise you have, very it's great to have your insight on it. And but based on what you just told me, my take is that it's then poor, it's mismanagement. Is wouldn't you say it's these different areas that have is it mismanagement or mismanagement of priorities at the like the maybe I don't know, the governor level, or would you say it's
Well, I think it depends on the area, and I've worked with folks who are in very, very rural areas where the decision is, do we pay for trash pickup or do we fund the ambulance service? So I don't think it's mismanagement. I think it's elected officials are in a very difficult spot of having to decide what they're going to fund. I've worked with folks in areas where the local officials have to decide, do we fund trash pickup or do we fund the ambulance service? And that's a difficult spot. If you don't fund trash pickup, as trash begins to accumulate, then you begin to have a public health issue, which causes an increased strain on the EMS system. If you don't fund the EMS system, then you got folks who are suffering heart attacks or being involved in motor vehicle accidents who aren't getting the care that they need and they reasonably deserve. So I think it's very difficult to sit back and to criticize, because the elected officials have a very, very difficult job. And what we're seeing now is, doing more with less does not translate to emergency services. We cannot run more fire calls or more EMS calls or do more fire inspections or manage more natural disasters with less resources. It does not work. And so as we continue to see call volumes increase and we see the potential as well as the actual number of natural or man-made disasters increase, we've got to maintain a positive approach, and we've got to continue leaning forward with that, or we're going to get steamrolled, and then it's not going to be pretty when it happens.
yeah, that's good. Agreed. Would you say has technology beyond AI, has any other technology been able to come and help facilitate some of this stuff and help you do more with less, or there's at the end of the day, it's all about having enough manpower to get the job done.
I think having manpower, having enough staffing is really the primary issue, and having the resources. I think as I look back over my career, technology certainly has played a role in that. We've gone from writing our patient care reports in EMS to doing everything by computer, which obviously gives us a much better way of pulling data and seeing how the operation is working. On the fire side, we now have thermal imaging cameras where firefighters can go in and, using the thermal imaging technology, can spot victims in a structure instead of just having to kind of feel your way through.
What can the public do, in your opinion, to help alleviate some of the stress, the budget constraints that you might be facing?
Well, I think it's important for the public to educate themselves about what the situation is in their area. In some areas here in North Carolina, the county is responsible for the physician of emergency medical service. In other areas, there may not be anything that specifies who is supposed to provide that. So you want to find out, who provides fire service in my area, who provides EMS. Is it staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of whether it's career or volunteer? Um, where's the closest hospital? How far is the closest hospital? And then, don't be afraid to ask questions of City Hall or County Council and ask, how are you funding this aspect of county government? How much how much of my tax dollar is going toward emergency services? Certainly the fires in LA have brought this to the forefront because of controversy over the budget cuts that the fire department was asked to make. And that's nothing new. That's nothing that's special to Los Angeles. Every area of this country now, departments are being asked to cut their budgets, to limit their spending. And there are certainly ways that you can do that wouldn't necessarily impact daily operations. But unfortunately, the big cuts, the large cuts, are going to have an impact because they're probably going to involve leaving vacancies unfilled. So that's a staffing issue. It may be, that we're going to trim the maintenance budget. So that means that you may not have vehicles that you need. Those are all decisions that are made between the department head, county leadership, or the locality leadership, and then the elected board. But we always try to make sure that we're maintaining that operational edge and making cuts that are not going to have direct effect. Now, there's sometimes where you can't avoid that.
And how would these cuts affect the fire department?
Well, the same goes for the fire department. They may be asked to cut back overtime, which means you're probably going to wind up either with, like I said earlier, with a rolling brownout where an engine company may be taken out of service for the day. You may wind up with only 3 people on the fire engine instead of 4. You may put a specialty piece of equipment out of service, like a ladder truck or a rescue squad. Those all have an impact on the daily operations. And so you want to make sure that you're still maintaining that adequate level of staffing so that your people are safe and they're able to do their jobs.
And I know that you mentioned the LA budget, and I think from what I recall reading, it was like around 18 million, which is like a very like a 2 or 3% budget cut. Would that 2-3% be enough to cause? Because some people were blaming it on budget cuts. Would that be enough to cause this level of?
Well, it depends on where you're making the cuts at. If you're going to cut your fuel removal part from the wildland interface that we talked about earlier, then it could have an impact on that. If that 17 million means that you're going to have to take an engine company out of service every other day, then that's going to have an impact. If you're reducing the amount of coloring books that you're handing out, that's when you make presentations. Probably not a huge impact on daily operations, but there's a PR impact there as well. And not to make light of it, because it's very serious, but I think the key thing is the department adequately prioritizing their budget requests and their issues, and then having that conversation with leadership and the elected officials, so that they know if you cut this is the impact it's going to have. And then being able to back that up with data. Agency heads should never be going into those discussions without some type of data to back up their recommendations.
Beautiful. I love that. I love the data-backed decision making. I think that's definitely something that's taking precedence right now in all of in corporate America, and having and data scientists are now kind of on the forefront with the emergence of the level of AI we have now, and to see that that's now also being done with government at a county level, in some case, state or federal level, is great to hear. The my last question around this is that, so the department heads or the directors of these services are coming in with that information. They have the expertise. They have the data. They come in and they present their recommendations to this elected board. These elected officials, are they, what level of government are we talking about here in most cases? And do they have the same level of expertise that yourself or your peers have, or are they coming in just career politicians and this is what they do? And
I I think it depends on the locality. You could have, and I've known individuals within the fire and EMS industry who have run for elected office and become elected officials. So they obviously bring a perspective and a level of expertise to that role that others may not. I think as a general rule, you will see most local elected officials are bringing some level of expertise in some government related area. It's just not necessarily emergency services. Now, over the last few years, there's been an increase in the number of folks within the industry who've run for elected office and been elected.
that's good.
And I think that's been beneficial. But when you're looking, most communities are looking at infrastructure, they're looking at schools, and they're looking at public safety. Um, Public safety to some may mean law enforcement, to some it may mean law enforcement, fire, and EMS. It varies. So I think it just is very dependent on the actual locality. Um, for us as the agency heads or the agency leadership, we have an obligation then to educate whoever it is on what our needs are, what our operations are like, and have them come out and visit one of your stations, have them come out and talk to the field crews, have them do a ride along with one of the crews, if that's possible, and let them get a feel for what those folks are dealing with each and every day.
Gotcha. And these elected officials usually would have, they just, their purview is just around kind of emergency services and the public safety. Do they usually cover anything else? Do they cover things like maybe like city sanitation programs or anything else, or is it just they're kind of every service is siloed to their own kind of board, so to speak?
No, I think for the most part, with city or county government, it's kind of an umbrella. They kind of cover all of that.
Yeah.
The difference there is that in a lot of places, schools will be run by a board of education or a school board, and that typically is a separately elected board, which presents a number of challenges because you have an elected board now that has to report to another elected board, and so sometimes that presents its own set of obstacles.
And then how do you stay focused on, saving lives, and when kind of politics adds so much noise and pressure?
Well, so I think Stephen Covey, said keep the main thing the main thing, and so that's what you have to do is you have to keep your focus on your mission. Um, I want our folks to focus on doing their jobs. I want them to have what they need to do their jobs, and I want them to be well compensated for doing their jobs. Let me and the leadership team worry about running interference on the politics and trying to keep that out of their concern. So many times people look at the agency head as being the one who leads the organization and gets everything done that needs to be done. I see it as, yes, I'm there to lead the organization, but I'm also there as a buffer and to run interference so that the politics don't impact the patient care, the emergency response, the fire inspections. And so trying to keep my boss, my boss's boss, and my boss's boss's bosses informed and educated And then if they have questions, try to work with them to address those issues. But I think it's really, at the end of the day, our mission is to ensure the safety and well-being of our communities. And so we keep that first and foremost in what we do. We use that as a filter. If it's not helping us meet that goal, then the answer is nope, not in our wheelhouse. At the same time, as we get ideas coming in, we should be asking, how does this make us better? How does this allow us to provide a better level of service, a higher level of service to the community? But let the politics go,
Yeah.
and keep it away from actually fulfilling the mission. It's not that they don't get involved, because they do. My goal is to try to minimize that impact on the folks actually doing the work.
I had one of my first managers. I remember one time doing kind of one of those annual meetings, and he came and said, my job, essentially, I work for you. He would tell me, and I'm like, what do you mean you work for me? I work for you. He's like, no, I work for you. My job is to make sure that you have everything you need to get your job done. And his job was to essentially remove all obstacles that might come into my way to get my job done. And so that's his job, is to kind of, so that I just focus on what I'm tasked to do, what my job description is. And he was then tasked with making sure that I don't have anything that would disrupt that, the main thing, as you put it. So I love that. I think that's a great sign of leadership. So it's definitely something that I've carried with me every time I find myself in that kind of similar situations, to make sure that I need to act as a liaison officer between the different team members, and one where I'm like removing any obstacles that might come their way, so that they could just simply focus on that. Last thing they need to worry about is stuff that is honestly beyond their control. So why even worry about it? So, right, so it makes sense. And any other personal insights you could share about maybe some of the in navigating some of the bureaucracies, or kind of, or describing some of the challenges you've faced in helping protect the public?
I think, the main challenge is making sure that we're doing what they need us to do. And so oftentimes it's, if you don't know what the public expects of you, then it's very hard to know if you're meeting their expectations. So it's important to try and get that realization. What's the expectation of the boss, the elected board, and how you try to meld all of those things together and still maintain your budget and still maintain your fleet and still keep your folks. And if you throw a budget crisis into the mix, you throw a pandemic into that. It's in trying to keep that focus again on fulfilling the mission. I think the challenges that I've seen in my career have largely been financial, and in retaining good people. And unfortunately, you win some and you lose some there. But I think the important thing I've had is that I've learned from each one of those experiences and use that to do better the next time. Again, kind of going back to the, how does this make us better? When you get into one of those challenging situations, is you ask yourself, okay, so what does this make possible? And the budget issue that we're facing this year, that's the main question for us, is, so what does this make possible then? And we need to look at those other options, those other things that are out there that we may not have considered in the past. But I think, I had a boss one time who told me, you never waste a good crisis. And you use that to better inform the future, either through what you learned and how well you did or how poorly you did, but never let that crisis go to waste, whether it's in educating the community or whomever, to how does that allow us to perhaps leverage it for the future, but always understand that there's lessons out there. It's just whether or not you're open
I love that.
figuring out.
So basically, it's like you try not to lose. It's either win or learn in a way, and whatever
Basically,
possible.
yeah.
Without the though I believe like definitely you're definitely gonna have some unfortunate events to take place, but I mean, if those events, like we talked to earlier, you can't avoid risk completely. You want to try to manage it, but try to get whatever, I don't want to say good, but whatever you can to get insights out of it. Um, one, I have two last questions. One is, what is something you wish the public knew as you are in the midst of responding to an emergency? Whether it's like it could be like a car pile up on the highway, or something where it's like a large number of people have been affected, and you guys have to disrupt, close roads or what have you. What is something that you wish the public would know that you feel like they usually, or like you see, or maybe some people, the public might complain about this or that, that you wish they knew?
I think oftentimes what we see now are folks failing to yield to emergency vehicles,
Really?
um, and understanding to move to the right when vehicles are coming past. The other thing is that you don't have to put everything on social media. You don't need to record what could be somebody's very worst day.
Or less?
I saw a sign a few years ago that said, "Please exit the building during a fire alarm before tweeting about it." And that to me, let's understand that in an emergency situation, we need to take care of life and property, and then we can tell everybody about it. So I think it's just being aware of your surroundings, yielding to emergency vehicles, and understanding that we're there to help.
I love that. There to help. And the other kind of closing thoughts here, maybe different ways of preventing, common causes of fire, maybe, or anything that common causes of maybe traffic incidents that you would want to kind of give some advice as the final closing thoughts here.
I mean, I think it's as far as fire, we certainly encourage everyone to practice good home fire safety, and that's making sure that you've got a way out, doing exit drills, especially if you have school age kids. They usually come home in October during fire prevention week and want to know what the escape plan is. Having a fire extinguisher in areas such as the kitchen or in the garage, making sure that your smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors all are functioning properly. And so I think we certainly encourage folks that way every chance we get. On the emergency medical side, I certainly recommend that everyone take a first aid class. And I know a lot of students take that while they're in high school or they're doing CPR. But know how to do CPR, know how to use an automated external defibrillator, and knowing how to get in touch with emergency services in your area. That's dialing 911. That's great. What do you need to tell when you call 911? They want to know the nature of your emergency, the location of the emergency, and then oftentimes they will provide you with instructions on what to do until the ambulance arrives. Just be open and receptive to that, and then assist in whatever way you can until the ambulance crew or the first responders arrive.
Beautiful. Well, again, Mark, thank you for your time. It's been a very insightful conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Very happy to have received some novel insights, and I hope that a lot of our listeners get to find it as meaningful and as knowledgeable or informational, and help raise awareness of the services you guys do, and how we can help, and what we need to be aware of in our local community. I think that's is vital. So again, thank you for your time and for your service.
Oh, thanks for having me.